Social media platforms like Instagram are at the center of the largest commercialization of public life and intimate experience in history. These platforms dramatically expand the availability of our cultural practices and experiences to the operations of marketers. If we think about how advertising becomes more powerful in the era of digital media platforms, it doesn't seem to be that the symbolic content of the messages has become somehow more persuasive. Instead, the medium has become better at operating on us, monitoring, sensing, processing, and predicting. In this research project, we've been experimenting with how we might simulate the algorithmic capacity of visual social media platforms like Instagram. Our aim is to critically explore how these platforms might operate on culture. We identify the state-of-the-art machine vision approaches, scrape a data set of Instagram images, and then experiment with what these algorithms can do with images. Our case study is 13,000 images from the Splendour in the Grass Music Festival in 2018. Splendour is a large, commercial, multi-day popular music festival in Australia. It's a spatially and temporally bound event where the festival, sponsoring brands, performers, artists, influencers, and attendees jointly generate sociality, mediate that sociality using their phones, and then register it as flows of images and machine-readable data on media platforms. We classify these images using both unsupervised and supervised approaches. Supervised approaches involve training a model to recognize predefined features, such as the presence of people, objects, logos, or text inside an image. A supervised algorithm is told in advance what the features are, and is trained to correctly identify those features within a specified error tolerance. Unsupervised approaches involve using a model to inductively recognize recurring patterns. Unsupervised approaches are crucial to developing a critical account of how machines can determine patterns in cultural archives, independent of human judgments about culture. We can no longer understand media platforms only by employing our well-honed approaches to their participatory culture, by talking to users and analysing the content that they create. We need to develop ways of also understanding their data processing power and its interplay with our cultural spaces and practices. We need to ask questions like, how do machines see and operate on culture? And how do machines influence the design of cultural spaces and our practices of cultural expression? Let's start with this dendrogram. It visualizes the 13,000 Instagram images organized into 27,000 clusters. Each yellow dot represents a cluster containing a set of images that has been grouped together using an unsupervised learning process. Reading the dendrogram from left to right, we can imagine a series of optimized splits. The very top left corner contains all 13,000 images, and from there, each successive cluster splits the images into progressively smaller clusters as it works down and to the right. So as we work down and left to right across the dendrogram, we find increasingly smaller clusters with greater similarity. By similarity, we mean that the unsupervised algorithm identifies patterns of pixels that have been rendered into numerical sequences. When we then turn our attention to these clusters, we can imagine both human and machine-like ways of seeing them. Although the clusters have been arranged using a numerical process, we can then come along and make post hoc human interpretations of them. Let's begin with a cluster that contains images of nighttime performances by the bands Franz Ferdinand and Dune Rats on the amphitheatre main stage. These performances featured high contrast neon-lit lettering of the band names. The cluster also includes a neon-lit robot at the entrance to the festival's general store, a neon-lit bar at the festival, and images from Smirnoff's The Wilds brand activation. As we work our way down this cluster, it forks and splits the various neon-lit spaces at the festival into different, smaller clusters. Images of neon-lit stages in one cluster, the neon-lit robot in another cluster, and various different perspectives of Smirnoff's The Wilds bar in another. The Wilds brand activation is a purpose-built, themed bar at the festival, as part of Smirnoff's integrated sponsorship arrangement. The Wilds has a kind of wild garden aesthetic with neon lights, greenery, and garden furniture, together with a bar, dance floors, and DJs. To a human looking at images in this cluster, the common feature appears to be the neon lights. Importantly though, the machine is not recognizing or classifying neon lights, but rather a common numerical pattern of pixels in the image vector that correlates with neon lights in the image that's rendered on the screen. The human sees neon lights, but the machine vision system sees a repetitive pattern of numbers. The unsupervised clustering locates and groups together images from the Smirnoff brand activation. This space and the objects in it are unique to the festival site. The brand activation sets in motion the creation of data that feeds the machine vision system. When we then go on and apply a supervised classification process to images from these clusters, they can identify typical objects like people and cups. In this image, the supervised approach identifies the two men on the swing, the cups in their hands, and some of the plants in the background. These classifications, together with metadata attached to the images, might then enable judgments and predictions to be made. In the case of the unsupervised cluster, it groups together images whose vectors share a common numerical pattern. In the case of the supervised classification, it labels image features with a degree of probability. We might also, though, think about how this process of clustering is prospective and promiscuous, especially in the case of advertising and advertiser-funded platforms like Instagram. Advertising has a higher degree of tolerance for misclassification in the sense that it's driven by the logic of probability and the effort to forge new and sometimes unexpected or unintended connections. One cluster features images of the Snoop Dogg hot dogs made by the art collective Cool Shit as part of the Splendor Arts program. In one sense, the Snoop Dogg hot dogs are an Instagrammable art object, objects that invite viewers not just to contemplate them, but to pose with them, take images, circulate those images online. This art object is performed via people's Instagramming. The art object is intended as a performance piece, as part of a larger Instagram culture. The object is exemplary of a larger process through which curators and artists orient themselves toward the digital platforms and technologies through which art is experienced. As we work down the clusters, we see the unsupervised model start to sort out perspectives. For example, one cluster contains mostly selfies in front of the artwork. Another cluster contains mostly groups in front of the artwork. Another contains images shot at a distance with sun flares or overexposure. Like the Smirnoff the Wilds activation above, the Snoop Dogg hot dogs are a visually distinctive object, and the unsupervised machine vision system can locate and group images of the artwork together. This pattern is evident in many of the clusters collected from Instagram from the festival, where distinct spaces on the site that are not pre-labeled in any training data get grouped together. This cluster contains images of the famous Splendor in the Grass sign, positioned on a hill as festival goers arrive at the site. It's a tradition among festival goers to walk up the hill and take a selfie with the sign. In each of these clusters, we can see the Instagrammability of the site. Here we mean Instagrammability as the cultural sensibility where spaces and objects appear designed or positioned to invite us to Instagram them. When undertaking participant observation at Splendor, we could see that certain spaces and objects invited festival goers to take images, and when scrolling through live feeds of images on Instagram during the festival, we were struck by the repetition of certain spaces, objects, and perspectives. The machine vision system illustrates this at scale, grouping together images of these distinctive spaces and objects. There is an escalating visuality of cultural events like Splendor in the Grass. The festival site is increasingly filled up with objects that are purposefully designed, not just to view or experience, but also to photograph. When we view the unsupervised clustering of those images, we can see how the cultural space, the smartphone, Instagram, and its aesthetics inform the repertoire of poses and perspectives. The unsupervised system clusters images together into a relatively finite number of poses and perspectives. The machine vision process we've undertaken here also highlights an overlooked aspect of Instagrammability. The more visually distinctive the site is, the more it invites not just the production of images, but the production of images that, because of their unique feature vectors, enable machine vision systems to link people together with experiences, times, and places. Instagrammable cultural spaces and objects stimulate data production. Creating and sharing an image is not just an expressive act, a vernacular way of appreciating a live performance or an art object. It's also part of the operation of larger machine vision systems. The performance's space or object takes a moment of attention and judgment, stimulates the translation of that moment into an entry in a database, and then because the art object is visually unique and compresses down to a unique numerical feature vector that exists in all those images, it acts as an object that stitches together moments in time and place within a database. Once one cluster of unique performances or objects has been found and classified or associated with metadata, then further queries can be made. The cluster becomes a query and the basis on which associations can be found and leveraged. The art becomes a stimulus for festival goers to do the productive work of linking themselves together in time and place on the databases of Instagram. The art objects becomes a piece of code, a unique numerical string in this operation. Once a machine vision system has learned to identify the unique numerical feature vector associated with a unique object, then further searches can be done for that vector elsewhere on Instagram to assemble larger clusters of users who photograph the object, are associated with it because of their face featured in images proximate to the object, or at the festival and interacted with peers who were photographed with the object, and so on. The logic of unsupervised machine vision is continuous, open-ended, and associative. There are many clusters that feature individuals or groups of festival goers posing in distinct locations around the site. A significant feature of these many festival goer-centric clusters is that they organise into clusters a relatively finite range of poses and locations. The amphitheatre, the gravel road, the tent. Images of female presenting festival goers dominate these clusters. In our searches through clusters in the dendrogram, we found none of predominantly male presenting users. In this example, we can see the repetition of a pose, a framing on a long vertical perspective, framed by the receding lines of the gravel road, similar time of day given the shadow, female presenting festival goers, and perhaps most curiously, each holding a red plastic cup. These clusters become operational when they can be inserted into larger processes of decision making and prediction within advertiser-funded platforms. For instance, if metadata attached to the images in the cluster could be connected to an interest in fashion, a gender, and age, then that could serve as a proxy for classifying other images of a similar kind for which there is no or missing metadata. Those associations could then be tested within an ongoing process of algorithmic targeting of cultural products and brands. The red cups might associate with a preference for alcohol. The pose or framing against the gravel road might associate with a preference for fashion brands. The cluster makes the initial move of grouping images together, finding practices in common, from which associations can be proposed, tested, predicted, and so on. Unsupervised and supervised classification are often then used in combination. We can take a cluster from the unsupervised model and then, using a supervised algorithm, look for particular beverage containers. This might allow the testing of associations with alcohol brands. In the case of each of these images, the individual in the image, the consumption of alcohol, and the cultural taste of the festival are all linked together. This is a kind of collaborative filtering undertaken not just by consuming content, but also by making and sharing it. As we upload images, we compile associations between ourselves and others, objects, experiences, and preferences. Unsupervised machine vision points us to the prospective nature of advertising on digital media platforms, driven not only by specified targeting of pre-labeled consumer preferences, but also by continuous pattern mining and prediction, sometimes of patterns that do not necessarily have symbolic labels. For machines, images are not meaningful, but rather part of an operation, raw material to be classified and clustered for defined ends. To draw on Preziato's description of the Playboy Mansion, Splendor is a bio-multimedia experience enclosure, where the body is connected to a set of information techniques. The clusters of images we've presented from our machine vision system are each the product of festival goers moving around the festival site, using smartphones to encode reality as flows of content that sustain attention and generate data. Before a machine can begin to cluster and classify culture, it first needs the mediatized cultural atmosphere that encloses lived experience and links it to the production of flows of information. In an unsupervised machine vision approach, the generation of clusters doesn't need to be right or wrong. Rather, their purpose is promiscuous. They prospectively cluster, simulate, and predict with the intention of finding associations that work. For advertisers, the value of machine learning is developing constantly evolving maps of associations that they can then use as the basis for experiments and predictions with consumer action and attention. In an unsupervised approach without pre-labeled training data, those associations do not need to be transposed into a narratable or accurate symbolic register. In the age of machine vision, advertising shifts away from representing and toward experimenting with reality. To understand the promotional culture of social media, where a platform's participatory culture is relatively visible, but its data processing architecture is not, we will need to continue to build machine vision systems in the public domain to enable us to undertake experiments to develop critical arguments, theory building, and politics about the role of machine vision in our media and culture.